What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the farm. Thanks for tuning in. It has been a while since I've uploaded a video. It's probably been the better part of 2 years or so since I've uploaded any content onto the channel. I've been meaning to get back into recording videos. Life has just been super chaotic. I've made a couple career changes since the last time I recorded, and unfortunately, one of those jobs I just did not have the time or energy to invest into the channel, so I really wasn't able to keep up with it. But the farm is still going. We've made a lot of progress on the farm since the last time I've recorded anything. So I think what I'll do to get back into the swing of things is we'll just do a quick update video. I'm gonna go around the farm and show you guys some of the projects that we've been working on and some of the progress that we've been making. So some of you might remember the trail system that we had worked on previously. We've extended that trail system significantly. We've probably got about a mile or maybe a little more worth of trails now. And we've been using these trails as fire breaks in order to utilize prescribed fire. You can see here actually. So this thorn bush behind me is called multiflora rose. And multiflora rose is an invasive species. Back in the 1950s, if I'm not mistaken, the US government decided that they were going to give farmers multiflora rose in order to create live hedgerows or live fencing, if you will. So what they would do is they would plant these lines of multiflora rose, and then they didn't have to build a fence to keep in their cattle and livestock. But unfortunately, there wasn't enough research done on that before, you know, all of these plants were given out to all of these farmers, and now it's really become an issue in it being an invasive species, and it really will take over entire trees and kill them and take over entire sections of the woods. There's a small section here where you can really see how thick those thorn bushes are, and you know, they're just, it's a real pain to try and get rid of them. But fortunately, fire helps tremendously. So that's one of the tools that we've been using to try and combat some of these invasive non-native species. So earlier this year, I got in contact with the Indiana Department of Natural Resources and linked up with one of their wildlife biologists. And a lot of people don't know this, but the Indiana Department of Natural Resources will actually help you with the process of building a burn plan in order to utilize prescribed fire as a tool on your landscape. So I got in contact with them. They came out, observed the site. I kind of explained to them what my intentions were with the fire, and they were more than happy to help. They wrote up about a 10 to 12 page plan for me to follow, and it was really great. Fortunately, in 2018, I worked for the Bureau of Land Management as a wildland firefighter, so I did have some experience with fire, but I didn't really feel comfortable burning this large of an area without, you know, some expert opinions or advice, you know, to just at least give me a little bit more peace of mind. So what we did this year is we burned about 16 acres of forest, and it went really well. The fire did a tremendous job in getting rid of some of the non-native invasive species. It really cut down on some of the smaller trees and smaller saplings that are, you know, kind of stealing nutrients from some of the bigger trees. And the other thing too is the less desirable trees, so your willows, your maples, your beeches, not that they don't have benefit to our ecosystem, but they're just not as valuable as, say, a hickory or an oak, some of those, you know, black walnut, you know, some of those things that have a little bit harder wood and have more of a market. So what we're trying to do is kind of turn this landscape over to more hardwoods rather than softwoods, because originally, before the United States was colonized, in the Midwest and where Indiana is, you would have seen much more hardwood stands rather than some of these softwoods that have come in now. So that's kind of a little bit of the process. I do plan on making a bit more extensive video on prescribed fire, how it works, and how you can use prescribed fire on your landscape, because it's really not that hard. It just takes a little bit of planning and a little bit of education, and you know, you can really utilize that tool, and it will save you a lot of back-breaking labor. So back in the early to mid 1800s when this land was originally settled. It was owned by the Phillips family, and they owned about 2,000 or 3,000 acres in this area. And we have since obviously taken over ownership, but in the 1800s, there was a cabin that was built on this land that the Phillips family lived in. And that cabin sat right here behind me. Now, obviously, you know, my grandparents bought that cabin back in the 1980s, and, you know, they lived in it for a couple years, but it was really in bad shape even in the 80s. It was well over, you know, probably 100 years old, and it was just falling apart. So Grandma and Grandpa bought a house across the road from the farm, and they were able to live there. And up until recently, my grandmother moved out because we had a storm come through and caused some electrical damage to the electricity in the house. So I am actually in the process of remodeling that house now. Quite the project that I've taken on, but we're going to document a lot of that as we go. But yeah, this is the site that cabin used to sit on. So you can see this big pile behind me. I hired a neighbor that has some heavy equipment. He's got a backhoe and a bobcat, or skid steer rather, and he cleared all this area for me. You know, it would have been a real nightmare to try and do all this by hand. So his heavy equipment really made short work of it. And I also hired him to clear a couple more areas where I had some invasive species coming in and different things that it would have just been a lot of back-breaking labor to try and do by hand, whereas he got it done in a couple hours with the heavy equipment. So this area behind me here was very overgrown and was really encroaching on the barn. So that was one of the other projects that I had our neighbor help us with. And unfortunately, there was a lot of invasive species here. There's a tree that's called Tree of Heaven, and that tree was really taking over this area. That tree is native to Asia, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm not sure when it came over to the United States, but it's really turned into an issue, and it's very hard to deal with and manage, because if you just cut it off, you know, at the bottom, then what happens is it will shoot a bunch of suckers up out of its root system, and you cut off one, and then you have 10 trees that replace it. So it's almost like a hydra. You cut off one head and 6 more heads grow. But this is what the Tree of Heaven looks like. It's not an ugly tree, you know, it's a nice looking tree, but unfortunately it releases an enzyme out of its roots, and that enzyme will not allow other trees to grow in the area. So with it being invasive, it being non-native, we definitely want to get rid of it, and we don't want to have it here on the farm. So we had a bunch of it here. We probably had about 150 trees, and we've probably cut that down to maybe 10 or 15. So now I can utilize some different chemicals to treat those and kill them off and finally get rid of them completely. Yeah, that was, you know, one of the projects that the neighbor's been working on. So we'll go and check out a couple more of the projects, and then we'll go over to the farmhouse. Okay, so behind me here, we have a pond that my grandparents had dug for the horses whenever they had horses. Kind of a funny story behind this pond. Whenever my grandma and grandpa bought this land originally, there used to be an old outhouse on the property. I don't remember exactly where it was. I'd have to ask my grandmother. But my neighbor up the road was really interested in that outhouse for whatever reason. I don't know why anybody would ever want an outhouse, but we traded, my grandmother traded that outhouse to have this pond dug. I think it's a pretty good trade. So what we did with this pond, over the years, there's been a bunch of trees and brush growing up around the pond because it's a good source of water. What happened was all of those trees were sucking all of the water out of the pond, so the pond hardly ever held water unless we got just a torrential downpour of rain. But even then, after a couple days, the pond would be dry and there wouldn't be any water in it. So we haven't really had much rain lately. We've had a little bit, but not a whole lot. But we only have 3 trees around the pond now, and the pond's holding water quite well. So I'm very pleased with that. We had some more Tree of Heaven over in this area. You can see one of them there directly in front of me. So that was another thing, you know, the neighbor, he cleared some of those Trees of Heaven, and then there was also an old fence line here. I have that recorded in several other videos, if I'm not mistaken. If you remember previously, we had worked on clearing the tree line behind me that was impeding on the power line. So that really is looking fantastic now. I'm very pleased with that progress. We've extended the pasture out significantly, so that gives us a lot of space for animals or gardens or whatever we decide to do. But what happened is we had a bunch of brush and trees and stuff that came around from the clearing. So now we have a giant brush pile that we're gonna have to burn. I did try to burn this pile the other day, but it was just a little bit too moist. So I'm gonna let it dry out for a couple more weeks and then we'll get it burned. So we got some gutters on the barn finally. That was a long project that I've been meaning to do for a very long time. And fortunately I got a plastic poly tank that I'm going to use to catch rainwater, so that way we can use rainwater to water the animals and water the garden. So this is the garden space that we had planted this year. It's roughly 4,000 to 5,000 square feet, and we really had quite the harvest this year. I was very pleased with it. Obviously the garden has gotten very overgrown. I've got more projects right now than I can keep up with, so I wasn't able to keep up with the weeding and stuff, but you know, that's the life of a gardener. So we still have a flock of chickens. We did have a bit of a mishap about a year ago. We had a predator that got into the coop and basically killed our entire flock. But we have since gotten another flock. They're actually out here enjoying the grass and free ranging on their own. This is the hugelkultur bed. If any of you remember that, in a past video, we built that bed. And it's really taken off. Obviously there's a lot of weeds and stuff growing in it, but my intentions will be to plant some elderberries and different berries in that hugelkultur bed as it continues to be more beneficial. So behind me is the old farmhouse. This house was originally built in 1950. It's got some interesting history behind it. Across the road on a neighbor's property, there used to be an old sawmill. And that sawmill produced all of the lumber that built this house. And this house is built out of native oak lumber from right around this area. And native oak lumber, true dimensional oak lumber, to try and buy on the market today would just be an astronomical price. So the skeleton of this house is about as sturdy as it gets. But basically everything but the skeleton of the house is in disrepair. My grandmother lived on a fixed income ever since my grandfather died in 2006. So she just wasn't able to really afford to, you know, upkeep and maintain the house as it should have been. And unfortunately, I didn't have much extra money to be able to try and help her. But now we've gotten to the point where we have decided we're going to take on the project of renovating the entire house, from waterproofing the basement to painting, new drywall, new electric, new plumbing, new roof, new siding, new windows, new doors. Basically everything but the skeleton of the structure will be new. So be sure to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for future videos where I plan to make that content as educational and as fun as possible, but still documenting what we're going to be doing. So that's the farmhouse. Let's go into the basement. Okay, so here we are in the basement. I apologize for the poor lighting. All I have is work lights right now because we don't have electricity other than with generators. But we've got a lot going on here in the basement. What I did is I jackhammered the floor up and built a trench all the way around the perimeter of the structure, and I'm installing a French drain so that way we can keep the basement waterproof. Now, waterproof basements are, you know, you hear about basement waterproofing, but you can't truly waterproof a basement. You can't stop water, right? You can only manage the water. So what we are doing is we've installed a paint that's called Dry Lock. It's rated for hydrostatic pressure, so water cannot push through the concrete block, or it can, but it will stop with the Dry Lock. It's a latex-based paint. And what I've done, that you can see down here, is I've installed some weep holes in the concrete. So that way, if any water does get into the wall, it will be able to drain out that weep hole, and then it will fall down into our trench, and then we'll have a submersible pump in this sub pump basin, and then all of that water will get pumped out, and we'll eject it outside, and then we'll manage it outside. Well, if you've made it this far in the video and I haven't bored you to death, thank you for enjoying the content. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe, like the video, comment on the video, you know, the whole 9 yards. The YouTube algorithm magic still is something that I do not understand, but if you do those things, supposedly it helps. So if you enjoy the content that we have here on the channel, please be sure to subscribe so that way you can stay tuned. I do have a lot of educational and fun, cool content planned for the future. We're going to get into a lot of stuff here on the farm, and we're going to really start making some moves to make some bigger things happen than what I could foresee a couple years ago happening. So thank you. I love you. Be safe.